Hi, Elena. First off, I really appreciate you letting me go this route for my oral presentation. Feel free to share it with the others in the class if you'd like, if anyone has time to watch it. I'd definitely be interested in getting anybody's feedback here. So I'll just kind of go through the assignment, and to begin, I'll discuss the way that I decided on which article to search for. So I ended up using Google Scholar to see what kinds of articles were available. And I used the advanced search feature to find current articles. For me, that was those published between 2013 and 2017 in the three journals that we were allowed to look in. And my purpose was to look for SLA articles that overlap with some of my areas of academic interest. So I searched for articles in those journals that included words like corpus or sociolinguistic in the titles. But the results for the search did not really produce anything that was especially promising. So I removed those search terms, but I left the journal restrictions and the date restrictions activated just to see what kinds of articles would show up. One nice thing about Google Scholar is that it returns the results according to the number of times an article has been cited, with the most cited article appearing first. So this is really helpful for someone like me who is just being introduced to SLA literature so that I can see what kind of articles have had the biggest impact. To begin with, I ended up selecting the article you see on the left here by Mary Schleppegrell. And I did that because it related to a paper I wrote for Tammy Slater's SFL course last spring. The article discusses the value of having a meta language for language teaching, and I find this topic interesting because of its crossover for both L1 and L2 instruction. However, after reading through the article, I noted that its focus on second language acquisition was minimal, so I opted for my second choice, which is on the right, and it's called An Eye for Words by Aline Godefroy, Frank Boers, and Alex Housen. I hope I'm saying those names right. Essentially, it discusses eye tracking as a methodology for measuring attention and the effect that attention has on L2 acquisition, specifically vocabulary acquisition. The background in the research question, the main overarching question that this study asks is, what can eye tracking tell us about the effect of attention on L2 vocabulary acquisition? And that's my own paraphrase. Specifically, to quote the article, it asks four main research questions, and they're listed here. So the first research question asks, do L2 learners fixate completely novel words in written L2 input longer than matched already known words? So looking at the amount of time that a learner's eyes are fixated on a word that they've never seen before versus a word that they already know. The second research question says, do L2 learners' eye fixation durations on novel words in written L2 input predict how likely they are to recognize those words in an unannounced immediate post-test? So is there this relationship with the longer a learner fixates on a word, the more likely they'll be to recognize that word if assessed? The third question is, does the addition of a appositive cue to a novel word influence fixation times for the novel word as compared to an unmodified text condition? So does it matter if there's some appositive that kind of restates this target word versus one that doesn't? And if so, does the position of the appositive cue relative to the novel word, if it's before or after, have a differential effect on the fixation times for the novel word? And the fourth research question, does the presence of an appositive cue to a novel word influence the likelihood that L2 learners will recognize the novel word in an unannounced immediate post-test? If so, does the position of the appositive cue relative to the novel word, if it's before or after, again, have a differential effect on learners' recognition of the novel word? So those last two questions are really asking about these appositive kind of restatements of some of these target words, and I'll talk about some specifics in just a moment. The motivation for this research is to determine if eye tracking as a methodology can provide more accurate measurements of awareness and its effect on L2 vocabulary acquisition. The authors discuss previous studies that have been conducted using other methods like note-taking, underlining, and think-aloud protocols, and they point to some of the limitations of these methods. By adopting eye tracking as a way to study questions related to awareness and acquisition, the authors can encourage future researchers to use this method as well. The theoretical orientation of the article is grounded in cognitive psychology And I think the authors do a really good job of clearly explaining this information, particularly for readers who may not have much of a background in this discipline. So for eye tracking in particular, the theoretical assumption relies on what in psychology is known as the eye-mind link, which states that cognitive processes are heavily influenced by the data our brains retrieve from our eyes. The authors also clearly discuss the psychological distinctions between awareness and attention as measures of noticing. So in this study, the authors make the case that eye tracking is better suited to measure attention because it not only identifies where a person's attention is at any given time, which is something that things like underlining and note take or other assessments do, but it also allows researchers to quantify that attention with the length of time that a person's eyes fixate on a target area. The primary reason I was attracted to this study was its use of eye tracking as a method. The director of my master's program uses eye tracking in her research often, so I'd heard quite a bit about it as a master's student and how the method is useful for social scientists. I thought this article would give me some insight into how it can be useful for linguistic study as well. So the research method here was experimental. The participants in the study were 28 college-age female Dutch speakers, and all were intermediate to advanced English speakers who volunteered to participate. And I think I counted right. There should be 28 of those little figures at the top of the screen there. Each of them was asked to read 20 paragraphs of text, English text, and 12 of those paragraphs contained a target word. In some of those paragraphs, that target word was accompanied by a pseudo word, a word that conforms to English phonetic and morphology rules but does not exist in the language. So the example they use in the article is panoplines. Sounds like it could be an English word, but it's not. These pseudo words were tested in an unannounced post-test to see if students had acquired them into their L2 vocabularies and to see if there was a relationship between the amount of time that students fixated on the words and the accuracy with which they could recognize them. So the target words and the pseudo words were introduced in the text in 4 different ways, constituting 4 experimental conditions. Condition 1 was a control condition where it simply contained the target word. So in this case, that target word is boundaries, and an example would be a sentence like, one demographical group stands out as being most likely to push boundaries and break rules. Condition 2 contained only the pseudo word in the target word position. So here we have panopline standing in for boundaries in this sentence. One demographical group stands out as being most likely to push panoplines and break rules. Condition 3 contained the pseudo word followed by the conjunction or and then the target word, as in one demographical group stands out as being most likely to push panoplines or boundaries and break the rules. And then condition 4 reverses those, where we have the target word or and then the pseudo word. So one demographical group stands out as being most likely to push boundaries or panoplines and break the rules. And those sample sentences come directly from the article. The authors used a Latin square design so that each participant read 3 paragraphs per condition in a counterbalanced fashion. It's a quote from the article as well. And they then recorded the first fixation duration, the gaze duration, the second pass time, and the total time the eyes of each participant spent on each target word or pseudo word. And finally, they administered an unannounced post-test, which was essentially a gap fill exercise to test whether the participants could recognize the target items. The study adopted fully quantitative methods in which the researchers set up an experiment, gathered data, and performed statistical analyses to interpret the data. The researchers measured eye fixations as a continuous variable in 4 conditions, and they also assessed the relationship between fixation times and acquisition using logistic regression statistical tests. The heavy use of numerical data and statistical testing formed the primary basis for my classification of the study as quantitative. The authors spent a lot of the background section of the article justifying the use of eye tracking as a method to investigate attention and its effect on vocabulary acquisition. They justify eye tracking in this way by comparing it with other methods that have been used in the past, things like note-taking, underlining, and think-aloud protocols that I've mentioned before, and they note the limitations of these methods. Primary reasons these previous methods are not sufficient, according to the authors, are they 1. Require too much intrusive cognitive effort in the case of note-taking, 2, they focus more on awareness than attention in the case of think aloud protocols. And 3, they don't quantify attention in the case of underlining. So after reading this article, I thought the authors were convincing in justifying their use of eye tracking. As technology advances, researchers will have more and more advanced methods at their disposal to find answers to research questions that may have been impossible to answer in the past. With eye tracking being a relatively new methodology, one that's made possible specifically because of technological advancements, it's not surprising that it has advantages that other older methods don't. It was also clear from the level of detail included in the article, including information on pilot studying, the assessment instruments, etc., that the authors were thorough in their study of the questions, which added to that credibility. So moving on to the results, I mentioned the research questions earlier, and the answers to these research questions you see on the screen here. So research question 1, L2 learners do fixate on novel words longer than words that they already know. Research question 2, eye fixation durations on novel words written L2 input do predict how likely they are to recognize those words in an unannounced immediate post-test. And interestingly, the researchers found that, this is a quote, for every second longer a participant looked at a novel word while reading, she was 8% more likely to identify that word correctly on the vocabulary test. The answer to research question 3 was that the addition of an appositive cue to a novel word does not influence fixation times for the novel word as compared to an unmodified text condition. And then again a quote, however, when an appositive cue was present, and more specifically followed the novel word, such as boundaries coming after panoplins in the example sentences that I mentioned earlier. The known cue, so boundaries, itself elicited longer gazes than it did in the reverse, where you have boundaries or panoplins or boundaries by itself. So that was interesting and unexpected. The answer to research question 4 is that the presence of an appositive cue to a novel word does not influence the likelihood that L2 learners will recognize the novel word in an unannounced immediate post-test. Overall, I thought the results were presented clearly. However, the organization of the results section, in my opinion, could have been tidied up. I always appreciate a results section that's laid out by research question, and I think the article might have been a little clearer to me if it had done that. The research questions seem to be answered in a number of different places. One other issue I had with the results section was in the interpretation of the 4x4x4 ANOVA that the researchers ran. In several instances, they refer to the results being nearly significant and marginally significant. Significance is binary. A result is either significant or it's not, and results can't be nearly or marginally significant. Because this is one of the first studies to use eye tracking to assess L2 vocabulary acquisition, future studies might adopt the same method to study different populations at different stages of acquisition. So for instance, the same eye tracking method could be used to assess novice adult learners of some target language to see if they acquire vocabulary at the same rate as these intermediate to advanced Dutch native speakers in this study did. Also, one of the main limitations of the study, the authors note, is its lack of qualitative assessment. They say, because eye movement data are quantitative, they do not tap into the quality of the cognitive operations that give rise to extended processing times. So future research might use eye tracking with other more qualitative measures, like note-taking or think aloud protocols, just to allow for some qualitative triangulation in those results. Primary conclusion that the authors make in this article is that, quote, there is a direct positive relationship between the amount of attention and the amount of learning that goes on. So in other words, vocabulary is not necessarily just acquired through reading, casual reading, but paying attention to certain words will allow people to acquire those words better and more just better. The authors don't draw specific pedagogical implications from their findings, but their findings can certainly inform pedagogical practices. For instance, teachers might plan activities that require students to spend more time concentrating on words that are particularly important to acquire, or that might make up some of their might appear on one of their own assessments. I found this article interesting for a number of reasons. I mentioned eye tracking as a method is interesting to me because it's relatively new and has wide applications across many disciplines. And I also found it enlightening to see how carefully this experiment was set up. It was well reported and carefully done. I don't, however, see myself using eye tracking or similar experimental methods in my own future work. My research interests are more centered on corpus linguistics and sociolinguistics, methods that allow for some qualitative interpretation. That said, I still think it's valuable to know what types of quantitative research methods are emerging, as they may have applications for the subdisciplines that I'm interested in the future. Um, that's my presentation. I really appreciate your time listening to it and look forward to any feedback you might have. Thanks so much.